So, I want you to try and imagine stepping into a massive historic library,
Okay.
like the kind with those towering oak bookshelves, you know? Millions of volumes, and the architecture just feels almost, I don't know, intimidating in its
Oh,
permanence.
yeah, I can picture it.
Right. And for over a century, every single book in this building has been meticulously organized according to the Dewey Decimal System.
Right, the classic system.
Exactly. And the shelves, they were physically built to accommodate this exact system. The librarians were trained for decades in it. The whole infrastructure, right down to the digital databases, relies on this one specific way of categorizing human knowledge.
So it's completely baked into the DNA of the place.
Yes, completely baked in.
Yeah.
Now, imagine walking into that library tomorrow and being told that, effective immediately, the entire collection needs to be reorganized, but not by subject or author, by the emotional impact each book has on the reader.
Oh, wow. That's not just moving books around.
No, you wouldn't just be moving things. You'd have to tear down the shelves. You'd have to completely retrain the staff. The physical building itself would actively resist the new directive because, well, it just wasn't designed for it.
The friction in that scenario is immense. You're basically asking an institution to operate using a paradigm it was fundamentally built to exclude.
And that is exactly the friction we're going to explore today, because you've probably noticed a massive shift in how schools, colleges, and universities talk about their curriculum, right? Their history, their future.
Yeah, if you look at any strategic plan today, you see a completely new vocabulary.
You really do, but it raises this profound question. When an ancient institution attempts to completely rewire its own DNA, how much of that is real deep structural transformation and how much of it is just, hanging new signs in that old library?
Right. Are they actually changing the foundation?
Exactly. So today, for our deep dive, we were focusing on a highly detailed 2022 academic paper. It's by Candace, Brunette, Debassige, and a team of scholars from Western University.
And what they've done is essentially an exhaustive audit.
Yeah, they mapped out exactly how Canadian universities are attempting to quote, indigenize their curricula following the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, reports.
And, the TRC investigated the devastating legacy of the residential school system in Canada, and it issued very specific calls to action aimed directly at educational institutions.
Right. And the scale of what the TRC demanded of universities, it really cannot be overstated.
No, it wasn't just a request for a few new reading assignments. It was a demand for systemic overhaul in systems that educate millions of people.
Yeah.
And the paper we're looking at today maps the very real and honestly often very messy mechanics of how institutions are trying to answer that call.
Definitely. But before we take another step, we need to set some firm ground rules for our discussion today.
Yeah, this is important.
Because we are wading into territory that involves deeply political, structural, and institutional debates, curriculum reform, deciding what gets taught and who teaches it, is fundamentally a debate about values and power.
It really is.
So let's be crystal clear for you listening. Our goal today is not to take sides or to endorse specific viewpoints. We aren't here to advocate for a left-leaning perspective, a right-leaning perspective, or anything in between.
Right. Our singular mission is just to unpack the findings, the historical facts, and the theoretical frameworks presented by the authors of this specific paper.
Exactly. We want to act as your guides. We're impartially reporting on the mechanics of these arguments so you can understand the architecture of this incredibly complex landscape for yourself.
And to help you navigate that, we're going to structure this deep dive in a very deliberate way. We have to start with the blueprints.
The blueprints of change.
Right. We need to establish the underlying theories of change that scholars use to even analyze institutional reform.
And once we understand those theories, we're going to look at the reality on the ground.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We'll examine 5 distinct approaches universities are actively taking today. Everything from trying to sprinkle new content across traditional disciplines to the intense debate over mandatory course requirements.
All the way to universities partnering with autonomous, land-based educational institutes. We're going to look at the limitations and the mechanics of every single approach.
So let's start with the vocabulary, because it's practically impossible to understand the mechanics of this change if we don't understand the terms.
Right. Indigenization and decolonization.
Yeah. If you read a university press release, you might think these are just, interchangeable buzzwords for diversity.
But reading through this paper, it becomes glaringly obvious that they are completely different operations.
Totally. Conflating those two terms is precisely where a lot of institutional reform derails before it even begins. The authors draw on several scholars to draw a hard line between them.
So let's look at indigenization first. The paper frames it in its most robust form as a process of resurgence, right?
Yes, it is the active recentering of indigenous ways of knowing, thinking, and doing.
And a critical component here, which is emphasized by scholars like Grafton and Melanson in the text, is that indigenization must be led by indigenous peoples.
Right. It is fundamentally about respecting intellectual sovereignty. It's about bringing something vital, living, and sovereign into the academic space on its own terms.
Okay, so indigenization is about bringing a specific framework in. Decolonization, based on the text, sounds much more like an excavation project.
It really is. That is the core distinction. According to the source material, decolonization involves the rigorous, unflinching analysis and dismantling of Eurocentric and colonial ideologies.
So we are talking about the ideologies baked into academic disciplinary structures.
Exactly. Into what is considered the canon of great literature or, valid science,
Mhm.
and into the very governance policies of the university.
The authors anchor this concept in a highly influential piece of scholarship by Eve Tuck and Kei-Wen Yang, and they offer a very blunt caution. They say, decolonization is not a metaphor. Let's stop right there, because that phrase, decolonization is not a metaphor, is a heavy anchor in this paper. What does it actually look like when an institution treats it as a metaphor versus a reality?
Well, treating it as a metaphor means using the word decolonization to describe any general effort to improve the school or make the syllabus more inclusive.
Okay, so if a literature professor swaps out a Shakespeare play for a novel by a contemporary indigenous author.
Right, they might say they are decolonizing their syllabus. But Tuck and Yang argue that this is a metaphorical use that actually dilutes the term.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, in its authentic, robust sense, the authors argue that decolonization demands the literal dismantling of colonial power structures and ultimately the repatriation of indigenous land and life.
Wow. So it is about material resources and jurisdictional power, not just diverse reading lists.
Exactly. Some scholars in the text argue that you actually have to decolonize the institution, meaning remove the structural hostilities, before you can even attempt to safely indigenize it. They are parallel, deeply intertwined, but very distinct projects.
Okay, so we have the definitions. Now, how do universities actually conceptualize going about this? The paper introduces a theoretical framework from a scholar named Sharon Stein.
Yeah, and she uses an incredibly clarifying metaphor. Stein describes the traditional Euro-Western university as the house modernity built.
And this house is constructed from 3 primary building blocks, right?
Yes. You have the wall of Enlightenment humanist knowledge, the wall of the nation-state, and the roof of global capital.
So let's break down what those walls actually represent in the real world of academia.
Let's look at the first wall, Enlightenment humanist knowledge. This represents the deeply entrenched assumption that Western ways of categorizing the world are the only valid universal ways to arrive at truth.
So it relies on strict scientific objectivity.
Exactly. The segmentation of knowledge into isolated disciplines like keeping biology completely separate from philosophy, and the belief that humans are fundamentally separate from and superior to nature.
Got it. And the second wall, the nation-state, that tethers the university to the interests of the colonial government.
Right? It means the institution historically exists to legitimize the state's borders, its laws, and its history.
And then there's the roof enclosing the whole thing, global capital, which means at the end of the day, the institution is driven by economic imperatives.
It has to secure funding, it has to produce research that can be commercialized, and it has to produce compliant workers for a capitalist system.
So that is the house. That is the massive, historically entrenched structure. When the TRC essentially demanded that this house change its fundamental nature, how did the universities react?
Well, the text synthesizes Stein's work with another framework from scholars Adam Gaudry and Danielle Lorenz to map out 3 distinct theories of change.
Right. Think of these theories of change as the blueprints for reform. The first blueprint is what Gaudry and Lorenz call minor reform, which they align with the concept of indigenous inclusion.
Yeah, and in this theory, the underlying assumption is that the house itself, the Euro-Western university system, is fundamentally sound. It just needs to be a bit more equitable.
So the solution is to simply bring more indigenous students, faculty, and staff into the existing structure. Let me test an analogy here to make it concrete.
Go for it.
If the university is that house modernity built, Minor reform is essentially just painting the walls, maybe buying some new furniture, and opening the front door a bit wider.
That's a great way to put it.
You are bringing new people into the house, but the floor plan is identical. The plumbing is the same. The foundation hasn't shifted an inch.
And that highlights the fatal flaw of minor reform that Gaudry and Lorenz identify. By keeping the structure exactly the same, the institution essentially demands that the marginalized individuals bear the entire burden of adaptation.
Oh, right. Because the university doesn't change its Eurocentric norms.
Exactly. It expects the newly included Indigenous scholars and students to figure out how to contort themselves to fit into a house that was explicitly not built for them. It treats the problem as an issue of individual access, completely ignoring the structural hostility of the institution itself.
Which necessitates the second blueprint, major reform or reconciliation indigenization. And this is a massive escalation, right?
Huge. If minor reform is painting the walls, major reform is bringing in the sledgehammers.
Wow.
Yeah, you are identifying deep structural flaws in the floor plan. You are knocking down load-bearing walls. You are acknowledging that epistemological diversity is required.
Meaning you have to validate entirely different non-Western ways of knowing the world as equally legitimate.
Exactly. The text notes this involves redistributing resources, altering how knowledge is produced, and trying to find a structural common ground between Indigenous and Canadian academic ideals.
It is a radical reimagining, but it still assumes the house can be renovated. The third theory of change, however, abandons that assumption entirely.
Yes. Gaudry and Lorenz call this beyond reform, which relates to decolonial indigenization.
And this perspective argues that the foundations of the modern university are so deeply and inextricably entangled with colonial violence and extraction that renovation is impossible.
Right. It raises this deeply uncomfortable question. Will even the most radical efforts to include Indigenous knowledge inevitably result in the university simply appropriating, digesting, and neutralizing that knowledge to maintain its own power?
So beyond reform is looking at the cracked foundation, looking at the toxic materials in the walls, and concluding, we cannot fix this.
Yeah, the institution itself might not be salvageable in its current form. We need to tear this down and build an entirely new house on different soil.
Now, the authors of the study looked at the landscape across Canada post-TRC, and their conclusion is quite stark, isn't it?
It really is. While universities frequently employ the soaring, visionary rhetoric of major reform, they talk endlessly about reconciliation and deep transformation. The actual material reality is that the vast majority of institutions are firmly stuck in the minor reform category.
They're still just painting the walls.
Exactly. And to demonstrate why, the paper meticulously analyzes 5 distinct approaches playing out on campuses right now. Let's look at approach number 1.
Which is the attempt to change what is taught across the disciplines.
Right. The authors refer to this as the add and stir approach, which is a term coined by scholar Marie Baptiste.
So post-TRC, the prevailing administrative logic was that Indigenous knowledge shouldn't just be quarantined in the Native Studies department.
Yeah, the goal was to expand it across all disciplines. Nursing, engineering, political science, literature, all of them should incorporate Indigenous perspectives.
It's the idea that you take your standard Western academic cake batter, you sprinkle in a little bit of Indigenous content, you stir it up, and suddenly you have an indigenized curriculum.
That's the hope, anyway. But to actually execute this, the text points out that universities rely on 2 main strategies.
Hiring Indigenous faculty across these various departments and asking existing non-Indigenous faculty to start teaching the content.
But the authors classify both of these as classic, deeply flawed minor reforms. Let's look at the hiring strategy first.
It seems obvious, right? If you want Indigenous knowledge in the biology department, hire an Indigenous biologist. Why does the paper identify this as a pitfall?
Well, the pitfall isn't the hiring itself. It is the structural reality of what happens after the hire.
Okay, walk me through that.
Imagine a traditional political science department. A university hires a single Indigenous scholar and places them in that department. Suddenly, that individual is profoundly isolated.
Right.
They are instantly tasked with introducing entirely new, often fundamentally different pedagogies and methodologies into a departmental structure that was built on Western political theory.
And the text quotes Tuck and Yang again here, talking about the invisibilized dynamics of settler colonial power. Let's break down how those invisibilized dynamics actually operate, say, in a Tuesday afternoon department meeting.
It operates through institutional inertia. the promotion criteria, the peer review processes, the accepted formats for publication, the way a syllabus is expected to be structured, all of these are dictated by Euro-Western norms.
So the lone Indigenous scholar is trying to change the department from the inside?
Yeah, but they have to constantly justify their methodologies to a committee of peers who may not understand or value them.
And they're expected to be the resident expert on all things Indigenous for the entire department, right? Sitting on endless diversity committees.
Exactly. All while still trying to maintain the intense research output required for tenure. The authors point out that this places an unsustainable, crushing burden on that individual without providing adequate structural support or a community of peers.
Okay, so that is the danger of placing a single expert into an unchanged structure. The second strategy is the true core of the add and stir dilemma.
Encouraging the existing non-Indigenous faculty to teach this content. This is where the paper's critique gets incredibly sharp.
Because the underlying assumption here is that a non-Indigenous professor can simply read a few books on Indigenous knowledge over the summer and then accurately integrate and teach it in the fall.
Right, and the authors argue this is a deeply problematic assumption because it completely undermines the rigor of Indigenous studies as an academic discipline.
It assumes that Indigenous knowledge isn't complex enough to require specialized scholarly training.
Exactly. Think about the hypocrisy here. A university would never ask a European history professor to quickly read up on astrophysics and start teaching it because they respect the disciplinary boundaries and rigor of physics.
Right, nobody would do that.
But there's a colonial assumption that Indigenous knowledge is just a cultural perspective, a flavor that anyone with a PhD can easily dispense.
Let's ground this with a concrete example to understand how this decontextualization actually happens. Let's say I am a non-Indigenous botany professor.
Yep.
I decide to add and stir some Indigenous knowledge into my syllabus. So I teach an Indigenous story about a specific river, but because of my Western science background, I teach it purely as a quaint historical metaphor for environmental conservation.
And in doing so, you might completely strip away the fact that in the original language, context, and legal framework of that specific Indigenous nation, that river isn't a metaphor.
Wait, really? What is it considered?
It is legally considered a living entity. It is a relative. By filtering that knowledge through a Western scientific lens, you haven't indigenized your botany class. You have actually mutated the Indigenous knowledge.
You've stripped it of its ontological weight.
Exactly. And turned it into a palatable anecdote that just reinforces Western scientific dominance. As scholar Kevin Fitzmaurice notes in the text, this approach risks usurping knowledge from Indigenous communities and turning it into just another object for Western academic consumption.
There is a quote in the text from scholar Erica Violet Lee that summarizes this perfectly. She warns against the danger of, quote, indigenizing the academy without Indigenous people.
It's a powerful quote.
It really is. The paper argues that if you just have white settler professors teaching Indigenous content through a Western lens, you are actually recentering whiteness and colonialism under the guise of inclusion. You're doing more harm than good.
Exactly. But, I see where you're going with this, and we should pause there, because you're touching on a tension that the authors themselves have to navigate very carefully.
Yeah, I am going to push back on the authors here for a second because I think there is a massive logistical bottleneck that they are identifying but perhaps not fully resolving for the reader.
Okay, let's hear it.
If we agree with the premise that non-Indigenous scholars risk severe decontextualization, and therefore the teaching of this specific content must be restricted to Indigenous scholars to ensure intellectual sovereignty, we run into a mathematical wall.
The numbers problem.
Exactly. We know, due to generations of systemic exclusion and the legacy of residential schools, there simply are not enough Indigenous faculty members currently in the academy to teach every single student.
That is undeniably true.
So if every university wants to indigenize its curriculum across all disciplines, how on earth do you reconcile the demand for broad education with the absolute requirement for specialized, sovereign expertise?
It is the defining bottleneck of this entire endeavor, and it is a very fair critique. To be clear, the authors do not argue that non-Indigenous scholars should simply do nothing and wash their hands of the responsibility.
Oh, don't.
No, the paper clearly states that settler scholars have a distinct, vital role. They need to focus on teaching the history of settler colonialism itself.
Okay, so turning the lens inward.
Right, encouraging reflexivity among their students regarding their own privilege, power, and the colonial history of their specific disciplines. However, You are right about the bottleneck regarding the transmission of actual indigenous knowledges.
Right, because someone has to teach it.
And the source acknowledges that bridging this gap without causing harm requires massive systemic investment in capacity building. You cannot simply mandate that a curriculum changes without providing the infrastructure to support the people implementing it.
Which pulls us out of the add and stir dilemma and directly into the second approach mapped by the paper: capacity building and teaching the teachers.
Exactly. If the institution recognizes the bottleneck, it has to invest in the unlearning and relearning of its existing staff.
And the paper highlights several innovative ways universities are attempting to build this capacity while desperately trying to avoid burning out their few Indigenous experts. Let's look at the first example.
Carleton University's Collaborative Indigenous Learning Bundles.
Yeah, so this initiative was conceived in 2018 by Kehente Hornmiller, a Mohawk scholar at Carleton. It is a brilliant structural response to the exact bottleneck we were just discussing.
It really is. Traditionally, an Indigenous faculty member might be asked by dozens of different colleagues across the university to come give a guest lecture on Indigenous history.
And that results in horrific burnout for that one scholar. So how does a learning bundle solve that? What is it, practically speaking?
Practically, it is a digitized module. Hornmiller and her team developed a series of online multimedia modules focused on broad foundational themes.
Things like Indigenous history, rights, or worldviews, things that have relevance across multiple disciplines.
Right. And an engineering professor or an arts professor can take this bundle and plug it directly into their course syllabus.
But the key here, according to the text, is the governance of the knowledge, right?
Exactly. These bundles are developed in strict reciprocal partnership with specific Indigenous knowledge holders and experts.
So the intellectual property rights are protected.
Yes. The knowledge is presented exactly as the knowledge holders intend, without being filtered or reinterpreted by the non-Indigenous professor who is hosting the course. The expertise is preserved, the sovereignty is respected.
And the content can reach thousands of students simultaneously without physically exhausting the Indigenous scholars. It is an incredibly pragmatic use of digital infrastructure to solve a human resources crisis.
It's a great model. And the text also highlights a much broader initiative from out west, developed by BC campus, called the Pulling Together Guide.
Ah, yes. The Pulling Together Guide is a suite of open education resources. It's designed as a professional learning series for faculty, staff, and administrators.
And what makes this initiative noteworthy in the context of the paper is its emphasis on localization.
Right. It is not designed to be a universal pan-Indigenous textbook that you just memorize.
No, it is a framework that explicitly instructs universities to adapt the material to reflect and respect the specific Indigenous nations, languages, and protocols of the physical territory where the university is located.
And the authors note that an environmental scan tied to this project found that you can't just read the guide and be done with it.
Right. Real capacity building requires face-to-face interaction, the creation of safe spaces for difficult conversations, and co-teaching with local knowledge keepers.
Which brings us to the third capacity building method discussed in the text, MOOCs, or Massive Open Online Courses.
Yeah, MOOCs have become a very visible way for universities to signal their commitment to public education post-TRC. The paper highlights two major trailblazers here.
At the University of Alberta, there is Indigenous Canada, which is a massively popular free online course curated by Dr. Tracy Bear that explores historical and contemporary issues.
And on the East Coast, Cape Breton University ran a course called Learning from the Knowledge Keepers of Mi'kma'ki, which was often referred to as Mi'kmaq Mondays.
The paper specifically examines the pedagogy of Mi'kmaq Mondays because of how it was structured, right? It was co-facilitated by a Mi'kmaq hereditary chief, Stephen Augustine, and a former faculty member, Dr. Ashley Consolo.
Right. And when the creators evaluated why that specific course was so impactful, they didn't point to the digital platform itself.
Oh, they didn't?
No, they concluded its strength was rooted in traditional ceremony and the intense focus on relationship building between the instructors, the community, and the learners. It shifted the focus from the mere transactional transfer of data to relational reciprocal learning.
But, and this is a massive but, in the text, the authors point out a glaring hypocrisy regarding these MOOCs and capacity building programs.
Yes, this is a crucial point.
These courses are highly successful. Hundreds of thousands of members of the general public have taken them. Yet the authors note that very few universities have dedicated permanent base funding to create more of them.
And even more critically, universities almost never mandate these intensive unlearning courses for their own internal faculty and staff.
Right. The general public is taking them voluntarily, but the tenured professors who are actually designing the university curriculum are rarely required to engage with them.
Which forces the university to rely on a specific type of employee to bridge that gap, the Indigenous Curriculum Advisor.
Oh, this part of the paper. The authors spend significant time analyzing this relatively new administrative role.
Yeah, these are academic development professionals, usually housed in the university's Center for Teaching and Learning.
And their explicit job description is to advise faculty on how to indigenize their courses, how to build ethical relationships with communities, and how to navigate the complex pedagogy we've been discussing.
And this is where the paper drops a piece of data that, frankly, is pretty shocking.
It absolutely stopped me in my tracks. It cites a forthcoming study by Raful and colleagues that analyzed the websites of 26 Canadian universities to see how these advisory roles were actually staffed. What did they find?
The data is a devastating indictment of institutional priorities. Across those 26 universities, they found a total of only 31 indigenization-focused educational developer positions.
Wait, let me contextualize that for the listener, because 31 sounds like a decent number until you look closer.
That's right. 77% of the institutions they looked at had only a singular position responsible for this work across the entire university.
We really need to dwell on the mechanics of what that statistic means in reality. Think about the sheer scale and bureaucracy of a modern Canadian university.
They're massive.
You are talking about institutions with tens of thousands of students. You have hundreds of distinct departments ranging from aerospace engineering to medieval history. Thousands of specialized courses.
And the data shows that 77% of these massive bureaucracies have hired exactly one human being to advise the entire apparatus on how to dismantle colonial structures.
And we have to look at the structural power dynamics of that one human being. They are typically hired as staff members. They are advisors. They do not have tenure.
Right, which is huge.
Let me use an analogy here to explain why that lack of tenure is the critical detail. It is like a city hiring one single structural engineer to inspect a massive 90-story skyscraper that is currently under construction.
Okay, I'm following.
But they give the engineer the title of advisor. This means the engineer has absolutely no legal authority to halt construction if they find a fatal flaw in the foundation.
But he can't actually do anything.
Right. All they can do is walk around the chaotic construction site, find the foremen who represent the tenured professors, and politely suggest that they might want to consider using different steel beams.
And if the foreman says, no, I've been building it this way for 30 years, go away, the advisor has no recourse.
Exactly. That analogy captures the exact power asymmetry the authors are highlighting.
Because an Indigenous curriculum advisor is engaging with faculty members who possess the ultimate institutional shield, academic freedom and tenure.
Tenure means a professor essentially cannot be fired, which gives them immense power to resist administrative directives they disagree with.
Furthermore, the professor possesses the authority of their specific disciplinary expertise. The advisor has to walk into a physics department and try to convince a tenured physicist to rethink their entire worldview, using only persuasion and goodwill.
Just persuasion, no actual power.
Right. The text explicitly notes that navigating these profound power imbalances while constantly hitting the brick wall of entrenched Euro-Western norms is incredibly onerous, exhausting work.
And it is vital to remember that this data only counts the formal roles. It doesn't capture the invisible labor of Indigenous faculty and staff across the university who are doing this consulting work off the sides of their desks.
Right, completely unpaid and uncredited, just because the institutional need is so desperate.
So if your entire strategy for institutional change relies on one overworked staff member, hoping that thousands of tenured professors will voluntarily choose to overhaul their life's work in their free time.
You can see why the pace of change is practically non-existent.
Exactly. And that realization that asking nicely doesn't work against entrenched power is exactly what has driven some universities to implement the most fiercely debated policy in this entire paper. Let's move to Approach 3.
Mandatory Indigenous Course Requirements, or ICRs. Approach 3 is where theoretical pedagogy collides violently with institutional policy.
So an ICR is a formal university policy that mandates that students, usually at the undergrad or professional degree level, must complete a prescribed amount of Indigenous-focused academic content in order to graduate.
Now, to be clear, the paper notes this isn't a completely unprecedented concept. Historically, certain professional programs like social work, nursing, or education have had these requirements.
And that makes logical sense. I mean, if you are going to be a social worker in Canada, Cultural competency and knowledge of the residential school system is a hard professional requirement for doing your job without causing harm.
Exactly. But what is new post-TRC is the expansion of these mandates across general undergraduate degrees.
The paper lists several trailblazing institutions that were early adopters of sweeping ICRs, right?
Yeah, places like Lakehead University and Laurentian University in Ontario, Trent, the University of Winnipeg, and the University of Saskatchewan. They required an Indigenous learning credit for incoming undergraduate students.
And more recently, we've seen massive, highly influential institutions follow suit. Like in 2021, the University of Manitoba and the Faculty of Arts at UBC Okanagan implemented their own requirements.
But because our mission today is to map this landscape impartially, we really have to look deeply into the controversy surrounding these mandates.
Yeah, when a university announces an ICR, it usually triggers a firestorm of debate, both in the academic senate and in national newspapers. Let's break down the architecture of the arguments, starting with the critics.
Let's do it.
I'll play devil's advocate here. From a conservative or libertarian academic perspective, isn't an ICR just overt ideological coercion?
Out of the come, yes.
Like, if I am a student paying $10,000 a year to get a degree in computer science, and the administration mandates that I must take a specific class on social justice and colonial history, many argue that is a fundamental violation of academic freedom.
Right. It is the university dictating political learning outcomes rather than allowing intellectual exploration.
Exactly.
That is precisely the core argument mounted by many critics, and the paper acknowledges this resistance. The defense of academic freedom, both for the student to choose their path and for the faculty to determine the core competencies of their discipline, is the primary shield used to block ICRs.
But the authors of the paper and the proponents of ICRs counter this by examining how universities already operate, don't they?
Yes, and the counterargument here highlights what looks like a massive institutional hypocrisy. We already have structural epistemic biases built into every single university degree.
Right. If you enroll in a Bachelor of Arts program, you are almost always mandated to take a certain number of basic science or math credits to ensure you have a well-rounded education.
And if you get a science degree, you are forced to take humanities electives.
And no one writes furious op-eds claiming that a mandatory Biology 101 credit is a violation of their constitutional academic freedom.
Right. Nobody questions that. So the authors ask, why is it that when an institution mandates learning about the history of the land the university is physically built on, and the history of the people who have lived there for millennia, it is suddenly framed as an unprecedented ideological threat to the institution?
The authors suggest that the intense resistance isn't actually about the bureaucratic mechanics of degree requirements.
No, it is about protecting the first wall of Sharon Stein's house, the wall of Enlightenment, humanist knowledge.
Oh, because when a university mandates Indigenous knowledge, it is formally elevating it to the exact same status as Western science, Western mathematics, and Western literature.
Exactly. It declares that Indigenous knowledge is essential, core competency for an educated citizen. For individuals who are deeply invested in the supremacy of Euro-Western knowledge, that formal elevation is perceived as a direct threat to the hierarchy they sit atop.
Furthermore, proponents of ICRs argue that you simply cannot function as an educated professional or citizen in Canada today without a foundational understanding of colonial history.
And the text points to empirical data to back this up, referencing a study by Aberdeen and colleagues that looked at similar foundational courses in Australia.
And what did that study find?
It concluded that mandatory foundational courses resulted in significant, measurable shifts in non-Indigenous students' views and actively increased their long-term professional commitment to social justice.
But regardless of where you fall in the ideological debate regarding the mandate itself, the paper points out that the actual physical execution of these mandatory courses on the ground is fraught with severe pedagogical and structural dangers.
Oh, absolutely. It is one thing for a university president to sign a piece of paper mandating a course. It is an entirely different reality for the person who has to stand in front of the lecture hall and teach it.
And this is where the institutional failure often occurs. The text notes that the Indigenous Studies units or departments tasked with running these massive mandatory courses are frequently chronically underfunded.
They do not have the resources to handle the sudden influx of thousands of students. Consequently, who ends up teaching these highly sensitive, highly charged classes?
Often, it is not the tenured senior faculty. It is sessional instructors. We really need to explain the mechanics of what a sessional instructor is because it is crucial to understanding the danger here.
Yeah, lay it out.
A sessional instructor is a contract worker. They are employed on a precarious course-by-course basis. They do not have the job security of tenure. They often do not have benefits. They are highly vulnerable employees.
And now imagine taking that highly vulnerable instructor and forcing them to walk into a lecture hall filled with 200 students who are only sitting there because the university legally forced them to.
The hostility in that room can be palpable. The text emphasizes that instructors of ICRs face immense student resistance.
And students who resent the mandate often direct their anger not at the administration, but at the Indigenous instructor standing in front of them.
And in the university system, student resistance weaponizes itself through a very specific mechanism, right? Punitive teaching evaluations.
Right. Let's unpack the mechanics of teaching evaluations, because to a listener outside academia, a bad student review might just sound like a bad Yelp review. Like, it's annoying, but you move on.
But in academia, those evaluations are the currency of survival.
Exactly. For a sessional instructor, teaching evaluations are the primary metric hiring committees look at when deciding whether to renew their contract for the next semester or whether to ever consider them for a permanent tenured position.
So if a sessional instructor is teaching an ICR and the resentful students coordinate to give them terrible evaluations, scoring them a 1 out of 5 across the board, that instructor's career can be effectively derailed.
The paper argues that implementing ICRs without providing massive institutional protection, smaller class sizes, and alternative evaluation metrics for the instructors can border on exploitative.
Because the university gets the public relations victory of announcing the mandate.
While the precarious Indigenous faculty bear the entire psychological and professional cost of the student backlash.
Which proves the author's point. If you are going to mandate change, you cannot do it by leaving the vulnerable individuals exposed to the hostility of the unchanged institution. You have to build strong, autonomous structures to protect them.
And that leads us directly to approach 4, carving out sovereign spaces by elevating Indigenous programs and offices.
To understand why the creation of autonomous departments is so vital, the text provides a very stark, necessary history lesson on how the Euro-Western University historically categorized Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, for the vast majority of the 20th century, if Indigenous perspectives or histories were studied at all within the academy, they were locked away inside very specific departments, anthropology and archaeology.
And the text uses a chilling phrase to describe how they were treated in those departments. They were viewed as atavistic objects of fascination.
Wow.
Indigenous peoples were not treated as living nations with dynamic, evolving intellectual traditions. They were treated as artifacts of a dying past.
They were subjects to be measured, categorized, and objectively studied by Western scientists.
But then the political landscape shifted dramatically in the 1960s and 1970s. You saw the rise of massive civil rights and sovereignty movements like the American Indian movement in the U.S. and the Indian control of Indian education movement in Canada.
And a core demand of these movements was intellectual sovereignty. Out of this activism, the very first Native studies programs were birthed.
The text explicitly states that these programs were created with a specific structural goal: to wrest jurisdictional control over Indigenous history and knowledge away from anthropology and archaeology.
It was Indigenous scholars claiming the fundamental right to study themselves on their own terms, using their own methodologies.
But the challenge they faced, and still face, is that Indigenous methodologies clash fundamentally with the architecture of the Euro-Western University.
Right. As we discussed with the House Modernity built, the Western tradition loves to segment knowledge into isolated silos. But the text explains that Indigenous studies fosters a completely different epistemology.
It is holistic. It is embodied, it is deeply relational. You cannot study the history of a community without studying its ecology, its language, and its spiritual practices simultaneously.
Because of this fundamental difference in how knowledge is structured, the current approach universities are taking is to try and elevate these programs from the margins to the center.
So instead of Native Studies being a tiny, underfunded minor program hidden away inside a massive faculty of arts, we're seeing a push to make them fully autonomous, heavily resourced units.
The source points to the University of Alberta as a prime example, where Native Studies is an entire faculty unto itself. It possesses the same structural weight, autonomy, and voting power as the Faculty of Law or the Faculty of Medicine.
And alongside this academic elevation, the paper identifies a parallel trend. a massive explosion of administrative elevation.
Yes, the paper includes a chart table 1 in the study that maps out the senior administrative roles across the U15.
The U15 are the top 15 most research-intensive universities in Canada.
Right. And when you look at this chart, you see a rapid proliferation of incredibly high-level titles. You see a vice provost of Indigenous programming at the University of Alberta,
A vice provost of Indigenous engagement at the University of Calgary.
a vice president Indigenous at the University of Manitoba, UBC, McMaster, Western, Queen's. They have all created these centralized executive-level strategic roles in recent years.
On paper, this looks like a massive victory for structural change. You hear a title like Vice Provost, and the immediate assumption is that the institution has finally handed over real binding power at the very top of the hierarchy.
But the authors of the source material are very careful to dissect this assumption. They identify a severe institutional ceiling that these roles constantly hit.
Break down the mechanics of that ceiling. What is the actual difference between administrative power and academic power in a university?
The catch lies in the governance structure of universities, specifically the academic senate. The senate is the supreme academic authority in a university.
So it is the body that actually approves, denies, or alters the curriculum and degree requirements.
Exactly. The text notes that while these new vice provost roles exist and certainly offer a powerful voice at the highest administrative tables, they often lack a crucial mechanism of hard power.
Wait, what mechanism?
They frequently do not have voting privileges in the academic senate.
Really?
Yeah. Furthermore, a vice provost of Indigenous engagement does not have direct hierarchical oversight over the individual faculties.
So practically speaking, the vice provost can't just walk into the dean of engineering's office and order them to overhaul their curriculum.
No, they can't.
Yeah.
Their power is often limited to facilitation, coordination, and strategic visioning. They must rely on their ability to influence and persuade the deans and the Senate rather than wielding any hard structural authority to mandate change.
Let me synthesize the frustration of this dynamic, because it is essentially an elaborate bureaucratic trap.
Okay, let's hear the analogy.
It is like you have fought for decades to be invited into the ultimate executive boardroom of a massive corporation, and finally they let you in, they give you the plush leather chair at the head of the table.
Right.
They put a brass plaque with a prestigious title on your door. They allow you to speak at every single meeting. But when it comes time to actually vote on the binding decisions that dictate the future of the company, they don't give you a voting paddle.
You're just sitting there.
Right. You have a voice at the table, you have undeniable visibility, but you have no formal veto power over the actual machinery of the institution. You are in the room, but you don't hold the levers.
That is a very precise articulation of the limitation the authors identify. It highlights the distance between visibility and actual structural authority.
And this frustrating realization that achieving true, binding, sovereign power inside the existing architecture of the Euro-Western University might be practically impossible due to these bureaucratic ceilings leads us to the fifth and final approach analyzed in the paper.
Right. For some scholars and communities, the most radical and effective way to achieve intellectual sovereignty involves stepping completely outside of the traditional university structure.
Approach 5. The power of partnership in land as pedagogy. This is the moment in the paper where the paradigm shifts entirely.
It really does. This approach is where universities stop trying to absorb, manage, or regulate Indigenous knowledge within their own walls, and instead start partnering with distinct, legally autonomous Indigenous organizations and Aboriginal institutes, or AIs.
To understand the significance of this, we have to define what an Aboriginal institute actually is. They are fundamentally different from traditional universities, aren't they?
They are. Aboriginal institutes are Indigenous-owned, Indigenous-controlled, community-based educational entities. They have their own governance structures, their own quality assurance boards, and they develop and deliver accredited certificates and degrees.
But crucially, they do it entirely on their own terms, grounded in their own epistemologies. The paper provides some truly remarkable examples of how traditional universities are partnering with these autonomous institutes.
The example that really rewired my understanding of what higher education can look like is the Dechinta Center for Research and Learning.
Let's talk about Dechinta because it is a true paradigm shifter. It is located on Aquicho territory in the Canadian North.
Right. According to the text, Dechinta is the only fully land-based, university-accredited program in the world that is explicitly mandated to serve Indigenous people.
What is fascinating is the structure of the partnership. Jacinta has formed agreements with major Euro-Western institutions like the University of British Columbia and the University of Alberta.
And those universities accredit the courses, allowing students to earn university credits for entire semesters of academic programming.
But the learning isn't happening in a lecture hall in Vancouver or Edmonton.
No, it is happening out on the land in the north, governed entirely by Indigenous protocols taught by local elders and experts alongside academic professors.
And then there is the Six Nations Polytechnic, or SMP, located in Ontario. The paper details how SNP formed a massive consortium agreement with a whole roster of major traditional universities.
Like McMaster, Brock, Guelph, Waterloo, Western, and Laurier.
Right. This consortium agreement allows students to complete their first year of university studies while remaining physically in their community at the Six Nations Native University Access Program.
If we evaluate these partnerships through the theories of change blueprints we established at the beginning of this deep dive, this approach represents the truest form of major reform, and perhaps even pushes into the territory of beyond reform.
Why is that? Because the Aboriginal Institute does not get swallowed or assimilated by the massive university?
Exactly. The AI remains a distinct, sovereign, and autonomous entity. When they partner with a major university, they are engaging in a nation-to-nation style relationship.
So they operate from a position of intellectual sovereignty and a much more equitable balance of power. It is a treaty relationship, not an absorption.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this brings us to what is undoubtedly the most profound and challenging concept in the entire paper: land as pedagogy.
The authors draw on prominent Indigenous scholars like Sandy Grande, Marie Baptiste, and Leanne Bitatsamasak-Simpson to explain what this concept actually entails. For a listener rooted entirely in a Western educational background, understanding this requires a total ontological shift.
Let's pause and define what we mean by an ontological shift, because it is crucial here. Ontology is the philosophical study of being. It asks, what is the fundamental nature of reality? What actually exists, and how do those things relate to each other?
In the standard Euro-Western ontological model, land is viewed primarily as an inanimate resource. It is real estate. It is the physical dirt that you pour concrete over to build the foundation of the university library.
Right. It is something to be studied, measured, extracted from, or owned.
But the text explains that in Indigenous frameworks, place-based knowledge systems operate on a completely different ontology.
The land is not an inanimate object. The land is animate. The land is kin. It is a relative, often conceptualized as a mother figure.
And most importantly for our discussion of university curriculum, the land is the teacher itself.
I really want to dig into the mechanics of this. What does it actually mean, practically and academically, for the land to be the teacher? How does a forest or a river teach a curriculum?
It means that pedagogy, the actual method and practice of teaching, cannot be separated from the physical environment.
In a Western framework, you can read a textbook about botany in a windowless room in Toronto, or a windowless room in London, and the knowledge is considered the same because it is abstract and universal.
Right, but in the framework of land as pedagogy, the knowledge arises directly from the interactive, relational practice of being on the land.
It involves observing the specific cycles of the seasons, interacting ethically with the animals in the water, and learning the language that evolved specifically to describe that exact geography.
You cannot learn the depths of the culture or the science without physically engaging with the ecosystem that birthed it. Leanne Simpson's work, cited in the text, argues that true Indigenous education occurs when individuals are deeply engaged in the practices of their ancestors on the land.
This concept completely shatters the first wall of Sharon Stein's house modernity built.
That wall of Enlightenment humanist knowledge relies on the idea that real, rigorous knowledge is produced in abstract, objective, temperature-controlled laboratories and libraries, completely separated from the messy reality of nature.
But land as pedagogy argues the exact opposite. It suggests that if a university truly wants to decolonize its curriculum, the most effective method isn't to bring more Indigenous books into the library.
The most effective method might actually be to leave the campus entirely, to walk out the front doors of the institution, dismantle the walls between the student and the environment, and go back to the land.
It is a radical challenge to the very existence of the physical university campus. It asks curriculum developers and university presidents to cyclically ask themselves a deeply uncomfortable question.
Are you simply trying to figure out how to fit Indigenous people and knowledges into the existing rigid structure of your colonial institution?
Or is your university willing to give up its control, give up its walls, and actively support the resurgence of indigenous knowledges grounded in the specific physical places and communities where those universities are located?
So as we pull back and look at this massive map of the Canadian university landscape post-TRC, what is the ultimate takeaway? We've explored everything from the superficial painting of the walls with the add and stir method, all the way to leaving the house entirely to learn from the land.
What is the synthesis of this audit? To synthesize the core findings of Brunette, Debassige, and her colleagues, the landscape of institutional change is vast, complex, and highly uneven.
The authors do not dismiss minor reforms, though.
No, initiatives like creating digital learning bundles, hiring individual faculty members, or running unlearning workshops for staff are absolutely crucial first steps.
They are necessary to expose the hidden colonial ideologies that most academics don't even realize they hold, and they begin the slow process of institutional unlearning.
However, the definitive conclusion of the paper is that if the ultimate goal is true reconciliation, indigenization, or deeper decolonization, these minor reforms are wholly insufficient on their own.
True, lasting transformation requires deep structural shifts in power. It requires moving beyond inclusion and moving towards centering Indigenous peoples, knowledges, and the land itself.
It requires actively, legally, and structurally protecting Indigenous academic autonomy. Because without structural power and sovereignty, inclusion inevitably devolves into just another form of assimilation or institutional exploitation.
As we promised at the start of this deep dive, our goal today was to map this terrain impartially, and I hope we have given you the theoretical blueprints to do exactly that.
We wanted to give you the lens to view how these massive, historically entrenched educational systems are currently grappling with the flaws in their own foundations.
The next time you read a headline about a controversial new mandatory course requirement, or you see a press release announcing a new vice provost of Indigenous engagement, you now have the tools to look past the institutional rhetoric.
You can ask yourself, is this just a fresh coat of paint on the same old walls, or are they actually changing the floor plan?
It is about analyzing the mechanics of power rather than just the vocabulary of the press release.
Exactly.
And to wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. We spent a lot of time discussing that beautiful, radical concept of land as pedagogy.
Yeah, the idea that the land is the teacher.
Right. If we accept the premise laid out by these scholars, that true Indigenous intellectual sovereignty is inherently tied to the physical earth, that the land itself is the ultimate teacher and a living relative, what does this mean for the future of education in an era that is rushing in the exact opposite direction?
Oh, that's a really interesting point.
Think about where universities are investing their capital right now. They are creating fully online degrees. They are pushing into the metaverse. They are championing virtual, placeless learning as the future of global education.
Right, taking education completely out of physical reality.
As the Academy moves further and further into the digital ether, can you ever truly decolonize a curriculum in a virtual space? Or does true, authentic indigenization demand, fundamentally, that we log off, step outside, and put our hands back into the dirt?